his community broke off from the community and left over what they understood it to mean to be a Christian. And when John is talking about them, he pulls no punches. He calls those who don't share his understanding of what it means to be a Christian antichrists. Antichrists. Wow. I thought Obama was the Antichrist. Or Trump. I can't remember which one. I thought the Antichrist was the end time enemy of Christ who would draw people to himself before being defeated by the heavenly Jesus King on a white horse with the seven-headed beast and all that. I thought that was the Antichrist. And why does he say antichrists? Well, I mean, that's just what it says. There was more than one of them. He says elsewhere, another place in the letter, as you have heard the Antichrist is coming, so now many antichrists have come. This whole Antichrist business is one of the great and unfortunate examples of the Bible going way beyond what the Bible actually says. The only time the word Antichrist appears in the Bible is in 1 John and 2 John. And it's used, the word appears 4 times. And it's nothing like what we've been taught. Antichrists in these letters of John are those who get Jesus wrong because they deny that Jesus is God come in the flesh. That Jesus is God incarnate, God in a human body. And so he writes to his church and he says, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is from God. That's the spirit of the Antichrist. Another place he says, who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. Now, on the other side, those of John's community that was left, these Antichrists took a big chunk out of that church. But the ones who were left, he says what we just heard. Who is it that conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? The one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water alone, but with the water and the blood. Church has argued forever about what exactly that means, but I think the thing that makes the most sense, the water of baptism, that's Jesus going, in a sense, into our humanity. Jesus didn't need to be baptized. And the blood, the cross, the crucifixion. In other words, believing that Jesus is the Son of God is believing that the one God sent is the one who came in the flesh and suffered and died. Now that belief, the belief that God sent Jesus to be God in the flesh, has power. It says in there, y'all heard this, those who believe, that belief conquers the world. I happened to be reading those words this morning at Biscuitville when that guy came in. And he said, there will be no peace. He was making a defense in the other parts of his conversation of violence. He was making an argument for conquering through violence. And he was clearly really disturbed by what happened to the Israelis. So he was not only angry and afraid, he was hurting. But there were limits to his compassion. When the person he was talking to brought up the Gazans, he kind of waved it off. That makes conquering more complicated. Now, he's not alone. Now, there are millions of us with varying comfort levels when it comes to violence. A lot of it goes unspoken. I mean, just because you don't have a gun in your house Doesn't mean that you don't have violence in your heart. But the deeper commonality among people who have a different view of conquering and about what Christianity means is that people tend to view the common good as a zero-sum game. You're either conquered or you're the conqueror. You either represent darkness or light, good or evil. You can see how a letter like 1 John can be. Also, John's Gospel and also Revelation, all of those are thematically linked, have a lot of the same language and words and ideas. And in each of them, they very much deal in opposites. Light and darkness, above and below, good and evil, truth and lies, life and death. Now, the problem with all this is that once you believe that the struggle, the area of conquest, is one of good and evil, then anything goes. That's when we start to forget that we have a limited arsenal for fighting. It's the ones, the tools, the weapons that Jesus had. Here's the thing, though, with the darkness and the light and the good and the evil. We don't get to decide where it is outside of what we're given. We're actually given ways to understand these extreme opposites. And to get at that, we're going to talk a little more about conquering, because that is a dangerous word. That stirs up all sorts of things in people. But the kind of conquering that we've been given, of course, is the kind that doesn't look like conquering at all. It looks like defeat. The first time we hear conquering is in John's Gospel. That's the moment that I talk about a lot because I love it. When Jesus is fixing to be betrayed and die the next day, and all the disciples are scared. He's telling them not to worry, I'm going to go to the Father. And they're like, what? Huh? They just don't want him to die. And he says, courage! I've conquered the world. I kind of see that moment as like a joke that doesn't land. Conquered the world. But in that conquering, we don't see a grasp after power. We see the subversions of power and all pretensions to power. It turns power on its head. That irony there, that conquering happens through sacrificial love, through self-giving. So hold that in your minds when we talk about where conquering appears elsewhere. Remember that moment of Jesus saying, courage. What are y'all worried about? I've conquered the world. Conquering is only found 33 times in the New Testament. 31 of the 33 are in John's letters, and Revelation, especially Revelation. In Revelation it says, to everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by second death. To everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. To everyone who conquers and continues to do my works, to the end, I will give authority over the nations. That's one of the ones that trips you up. If you get too heady, thinking about all that conquering and all the good stuff that's going to happen for those who conquer, then he throws in that. Conquers and continues to do my good works. Now that fits in perfect with what we've heard John say in 1 John over and over again. If we want to be sure that we know him, we obey his commandments. If a person says, I've come to know Jesus, but does not obey the commandments, he's a liar. The truth doesn't exist in them. But whoever obeys his word, truly in this person the love of God has reached perfection. By this we may be sure that we are in him. Whoever says, I abide in him, ought to walk just like he walks. That's the conquering. The walking your steps in the steps of Jesus. That's the conquering faith. Now, for such a big word in the Bible, faith actually only appears once in John's letters, and Revelation. One time, in this passage we have for today. A few times it shows up in the form of faithfulness. And sometimes John is talking about God's faithfulness, sometimes about Jesus' faithfulness, sometimes about ours. In 3 John, he says, I was overjoyed when some of our friends arrived and testified to your faithfulness to the truth, namely, how you walk in the truth. There it is again. He doesn't say, I was so tickled that all of you nailed your catechism, that you know how to say the right things. He said, I heard that y'all are walking just as Jesus walked. That's the stuff. And even though the Antichrists over there kind of got the boot, or probably excused themselves, would be my guess, over belief, it's not just belief. Nobody conquered nothing, least of all Jesus, with belief alone. Belief alone will not conquer anything. It's why the beliefs of the Antichrists are so problematic, because in believing the wrong things about Jesus, that informs the things that they do. Because if Jesus didn't take flesh, if the whole thing is just kind of spiritualized, where Jesus was, like one of us, but he had some sort of other way of God living through him. Not God in human flesh, but God sort of somehow in one of us. And that's what's resurrected, not the body. If you've got that theology, all of a sudden bodies don't matter for much, do they? But if God took human flesh, then all human flesh matters. And so what we do with our flesh and with the lives and the bodies of other people, that's the measure of faithfulness. That's conquering. When it came to belief, I think the Antichrists were winning. I think that their church just kept getting bigger while John's church just kept getting smaller. John says people were listening to him. You got one Christ, and then you've got many Antichrists. The difference is belief, and belief leads to the kind of doing that we think is important. It would be so much easier if it were about belief and only belief. But John makes this impossible. This letter is both wonderful to read and exhausting to read, because it seems to just talk in circles. This is love, that if you obeying is love. And how do we obey? By loving. It's all in there together. There's no way to separate belief from love in truth and action. But that's the conquering faith. We are hemmed in. John hems us in, showing us no other way to believe than to love. It's like Paul said in Galatians, the only thing that counts for anything is faith working through love. Believing that the one who came from God took on flesh. And so we love as we have been loved, seeing the dignity in all people, walking the walk. Faith without love, it's like a nightmare where you're screaming but no sound comes out. You're removed from the reality, from the abiding. So we walk the walk, we talk the talk. You got to have both. That's one of our problems today, I think, is that a lot of folks have just stopped talking the talk. They don't have a gospel to be accountable to because they stop proclaiming it. They're preaching something else. But we're called to both, a unity of belief and action. Just as God sent Jesus, Jesus sends us. And together, we do whatever conquering we do together, our faith. Loving one another, loving our neighbor. It is our witness to a different way of being in the world. And it matters. It's never just words. One more thing, and this is my favorite thing. There's a little discomfort in this, for me anyway. Like, how quick is John to call the ones who left anti-Christ? He says, we knew they never belonged because they left. And so what he does is he draws this sharp contrast between those who belong to Christ and those who are anti-Christ. Kind of creates a strong motivation to not leave the congregation. Because if you do, you're going to get labeled anti-Christ. That us versus them kind of thing, that doesn't feel quite right. But what John does, once he creates this hard, right, wrong, good, evil, us versus them, he subverts it. He turns it back on everybody. And he does that by making the criterion of faith not just belief, but actions. He assumes that it has to take flesh in good works. So he doesn't leave them with the option of dismissing the Antichrist because they don't believe right. He seems to even it out at every turn. He talks about the speech of the Antichrist, but then he says that those who confidently confess their faith with their mouth effectively deny it with the way that they live. He talks about the Antichrist being a liar. Who is the liar but the one who denies Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist. But then he says, whoever says I know him but does not obey his commandments is a liar. So all of a sudden, everybody's kind of at risk of Antichristness. And what's the measure? The measure is always love. Paul says the same thing. If you don't got love, you're just Doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what you can do. You've got to have that. So when somebody comes to the end of 1 John, even though it's a book of assurance, a letter of assurance to the congregation, the end goal is not to walk away from it and say, thank God I believe the right things. I'm no Antichrist. At the end of that book, we have to ask, am I? If the measure is not just belief, but action. Augustine said that in his deeds, the one who denies Christ is an Antichrist. In what you do, that's how you become an Antichrist. So, it's hard for us in some ways, but I think it's necessary to look beyond ourselves. When I say millions of Christians, one of the things I'm saying is that it's not just us. When 2 or 3 are gathered, we're gathering with people all over the world, with people in churches who are hearing things that are, can I say Antichrist? I think I can. Because I'm not anti-Antichrist. Because if I was anti-Antichrist, I better be careful. because I don't always love. I'm not always nonviolent. Sometimes I enjoy talking a lot more than I enjoy doing. That's right. Yes. One guy who I found when I was researching about this said, "We have seen the Antichrist, and he is us." How about that? But it doesn't have to be, you know. There will be no peace, that guy said. And he's right, there won't be, if we don't want it. Y'all, we have to desire the right kind of conquering. And so, the last thing I'll say is anchor it. Anchor it in that moment when Jesus says, "Courage, I have conquered the world." The irony there, the humor even, that's the heart of the gospel. Another way to put it may be you're either in on the joke or you're Antichrist. Either you see the wonderful, beautiful, life-changing irony that power and freedom, everything good that we desire, it's only found in the way of Jesus Christ. That way of nonviolent, self-giving love of our neighbor. Now, obviously, y'all, all this stuff is on my mind. I mean, not just because this is what the lectionary served up, but because as I get more into this work that I've told you about the last few weeks with the Poor People's Campaign, trying to get people to see this movie, Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy, all these things. I feel it, how we have to do all of that a certain way. That's why I love that. I love courage. I've overcome the world. I think the thing that ought to mark us is both deep engagement in the world and the freedom of knowing that the faith that conquers is the faith that makes it possible to love your enemies. But it's awkward. Some people do actually want me to get up here and talk about how deeply messed up things are in the church. And it's true. There has to be some of that. But unlike John's congregation, we can't write off everybody else. But loving can mean a counter witness, a bold counter witness. If I weren't so busy trying to get ready in Biscuitville this morning, this is my excuse for why I didn't go up to that fella and be like, "Hey, can I buy you a biscuit? You seem pretty well and tight. Let's talk." We are set free for freedom. And we can provide one another with it too. When our trust is where the only place that trust is trustworthy. In the one who conquered the grave by letting the violence come to him. Never once letting it flow out of him. May it be that way with us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.